On a humid afternoon in September 2023, in the outskirts of Kathmandu, Nepal, a housekeeper at a quiet hillside guesthouse walked up a narrow set of concrete stairs to knock on the door of room 203. There had been no movement from the room since. The night before, the guest staying there, solo traveler from Australia, hadn't come down for breakfast, hadn't responded to greetings, and her social media, which typically lit up each morning with stories of sunrise, yoga or tea by the mountain view, had gone silent. When the staff member opened the door with a backup key, what they found inside would send quiet shockwaves through both the local authorities and the online travel community. Inside, lying near the bed in an awkward position, was Katie Cunningham, a wellness influencer whose dreamy, introspective posts had garnered her tens of thousands of followers across platforms. Her body was lifeless, pale. The room was undisturbed, her belongings strewn in a familiar mess of notebooks, essential oils, and clothes. The lights were off, the windows shut. The door had been locked from the inside. There were no signs of trauma, no broken glass, no cries for help, just silence. By that evening, local police had cordoned off the guesthouse room. A statement was issued to local press in Kathmandu, vaguely attributing the death to a suspected medical cause. No foul play was suspected. An autopsy was requested, but the process was delayed by both logistical and cultural challenges. As news trickled back to Australia and across social media, speculation began to spread. Was it a stroke, a heart attack, something more sinister? What could have caused a vibrant, seemingly healthy woman in her early 30s to die, alone, in a quiet Himalayan guesthouse? Katie's story wasn't a mystery thriller. It wasn't a high-altitude expedition gone wrong. She wasn't lost in the jungle or swept away by a monsoon. She died in a room, behind a locked door, on a retreat meant for healing. But the deeper questions began bubbling beneath the surface. What were the days leading up to her death, really? Like, did she feel something was wrong? Could she have been saved? Katie had begun her solo journey earlier that year, a slow route across Southeast Asia after what friends say was a difficult breakup and a period of burnout. She'd been documenting her journey publicly, but thoughtfully balancing curated content with honest reflections on mental health, healing, and solitude. By the time she arrived in Kathmandu, she had spent nearly 3 months traveling solo. Kathmandu, with its sacred stupas and chaotic markets, had always drawn travelers seeking transformation. Katie was no different. Her last Instagram post, uploaded 2 days before her death, showed her standing barefoot in front of the massive white dome of Buddhanath Stupa, eyes closed, fingers laced in front of her chest. The caption read, "Sometimes you have to come to the other side of the world to remember who you are." But beneath the poetic tone of her posts, there were subtle shifts. Friends noticed she'd been quieter in group chats. She'd cancelled a Zoom call with her sister 2 days before her passing. One friend noted that Katie mentioned a weird tension in her chest. During a voice note from her layover in Delhi, she brushed it off, blaming altitude, bad sleep, and the change in diet. None of it seemed urgent until it was too late. This story isn't about chasing conspiracies or filling in blanks with fantasy. It's about what we do know. A solo traveler, already in a vulnerable state of transition, entered a foreign environment known for both beauty and danger. It's about the risks that aren't obvious, the ones that unfold slowly, quietly, and often go unnoticed until they become irreversible. Katie Cunningham's death in Kathmandu was shocking, but it wasn't unprecedented. And understanding what happened in those final days might help protect the next traveler chasing meaning in the mountains. Act 2. Kathmandu isn't Everest, and yet it sits nearly 1,400 meters above sea level, surrounded by ridges that rise quickly into the clouds. For many tourists, especially those coming from sea-level cities like Sydney or Los Angeles, the altitude, while not extreme, can still pose a physiological challenge. The symptoms creep in slowly: mild headaches, sleeplessness, nausea, shortness of breath during walks. Most people adjust after a day or two, but for a small percentage, especially those already under physical or emotional stress, the body doesn't cope. And sometimes it fails. Katie had checked into the guesthouse 3 days before her death. It wasn't a luxury hotel. It was modest, tucked into the hills of Budanelkantha, north of the main city, where guesthouses are quieter and the air cooler. The owner later told a local reporter that Katie had requested solitude, She didn't want guided tours or trekking arrangements. She asked for herbal tea in the mornings and hot water for baths in the evening. Her days were uneventful: light yoga on the patio, walks through the nearby Shivapuri forest, and long periods sitting on the rooftop watching the haze settle over the valley. To those around her, she seemed peaceful, but quietly, subtle changes were taking place. She had skipped dinner on the second night. She complained to a staff member about weird dreams and tight breathing, though she laughed it off as jet lag. The next morning, she came downstairs late and told the cook she hadn't slept well. Again, no alarm was raised. Katie was known to be independent, often brushing off discomfort, but in the context of travel fatigue, mild elevation, possible dehydration, and emotional exhaustion, her symptoms could have been signs of something more serious. It's important to understand the backdrop. Solo travelers in Nepal often face invisible risks. Dehydration is common. So is overexertion, especially when adjusting to a new altitude. Food poisoning, even mild, can throw off electrolyte levels. Combine that with insomnia, anxiety, and possible pre-existing health issues, and the body can react in unexpected ways. Add isolation, no travel companion to notice slurred speech, labored breathing, or confusion, and it becomes easy to miss the moment when things cross from uncomfortable to dangerous. Katie had reportedly brought herbal supplements with her turmeric capsules, valerian root, magnesium, but no known prescription medications. Her phone records showed no emergency calls, no attempts to reach out during her final night, and when her room was searched, there was no alcohol, no drugs, nothing to suggest deliberate harm. What remained was a woman who simply stopped. Her heart, her breathing, her journey. The autopsy, performed in Kathmandu General Hospital, listed the cause of death as sudden cardiopulmonary arrest of undetermined origin. In plain terms, her heart stopped. No specific cause could be determined. Her family requested further investigation back in Australia, but with limited tissue samples and no prior health records indicating problems, no deeper conclusion was reached. Friends close to her mentioned one possible clue, that Katie had experienced a brief fainting episode. 2 months prior in India, she had collapsed briefly in a cafe in Jaipur. After a long walk in the sun, locals helped her up. She drank water, took salt, and said she was fine. She never sought medical attention afterward. That incident, dismissed at the time, now loomed with heavier meaning. Katie's story, when viewed with hindsight, reveals a layered truth. Not every tragedy is loud. Some unfold in whispers, and in travel, especially alone, especially far from help, those whispers matter. While it's easy to view Katie Cunningham's passing as a rare or inexplicable tragedy, the deeper you look, the more you begin to see patterns. Her death fits into a quiet but alarming trend, one that doesn't get the attention it deserves, especially in social media spaces that glorify solo travel and spiritual getaways. Nepal, in particular, draws thousands of travelers each year, with its reputation as a place of inner transformation, mysticism, and nature-based healing. But its remote conditions, unreliable infrastructure, and harsh terrain have also claimed many lives. Between 2009 and 2019 alone, more than 300 foreign tourists died in Nepal, and that's just what's been officially documented. Causes vary: altitude, sickness, falls, animal attacks, even gastrointestinal issues that spiral due to lack of access to care. The most dangerous part: these deaths rarely make headlines. Katie's did, only because she had followers. The day before she was found, hotel staff later reported that she didn't leave her room after breakfast. One person noted they hadn't seen her since early evening the night before. In other words, there was a 24 to 36-hour window where Katie likely began feeling unwell, deteriorated, and succumbed to whatever was happening inside her body. In silence, with no one noticing in time, she wasn't hiking Everest. She wasn't trekking across the Annapurna circuit. She was inside a cozy lodge, just 10 kilometers from the Kathmandu city center. That's what makes it more haunting, because it challenges our assumptions. You don't need to be dangling off a cliff to be in danger in the Himalayas. Sometimes, all it takes is a perfect storm of subtle stressors: mild dehydration, unfamiliar elevation, thin oxygen, fatigue, and the absence of someone to say, "Are you okay?" She had recently recovered from a stomach bug in India. She had lost some weight. She had no known heart conditions, but as her family would later share, She had fainted unexpectedly 2 months prior while on a night bus in northern India. Was brief. She brushed it off. There was no hospital visit. Her guest house didn't have an intercom system. Her phone had no working SIM, and local Wi-Fi was down due to a routine blackout the night before. Her room didn't have a landline, and there were no guests booked in the rooms on either side of hers. Even if Katie had tried to call for help, there's a very real possibility that no one would have heard her. This isn't just a matter of gear or preparation. It's a stark reminder of how fragile travel can become when everything is left up to chance. And that's not to criticize her, not even close. Katie was an experienced traveler. She'd been to over 20 countries. She was street smart, self-aware, and intentional about her routines. But even the most seasoned wanderers sometimes miscalculate how dangerous comfort can feel. She chose solitude as a form of healing. But solitude in places with unreliable access to emergency services, no direct connection to others, and environmental stressors like elevation can become fatal when the body sends distress signals that go unacknowledged. The question remains, did she simply fall asleep and not wake up, or did she suffer in silence for hours, unable to reach anyone, too disoriented to understand what was happening? We'll never know. But we do know this: being alone in the wrong place at the wrong time, even a peaceful one, can be just as risky as the wildest mountain expedition. Act for Katie Cunningham's story stayed in the news cycle for just a few days, and then it faded. That's often what happens. Tragedies that don't involve violence or scandal tend to get washed away by the next headline. But if you scroll through the comments on her last Instagram posts, still frozen in time, you'll see the real impact. Dozens of people write, "Even today, you inspired me to travel. I'm heartbroken. You looked so alive." One woman commented, "I booked my first solo trip because of you." And that's where we have to pause and reflect. Because Katie didn't die doing something reckless. She died doing something that millions of women do every year, traveling alone in search of peace. But peace doesn't guarantee safety. And we owe it to her memory, and to those inspired by her, to be honest about the risks that even beautiful places can hide. Kathmandu is often viewed as a gateway, a launch point for adventure, but it is also a high-altitude city with patchy medical care, chaotic infrastructure, and conditions that can change rapidly. You don't have to be at Everest Base Camp to experience AMS, acute mountain sickness. Symptoms can begin as low as 2,000 meters dizziness, headaches, shortness of breath, and in rare cases, cerebral or pulmonary edema. These symptoms can look like fatigue. They can feel like emotional stress, and when you're alone, you might dismiss them as jet lag or anxiety. Katie had no one in the room to challenge that assumption. There was no hiking partner to say, "You don't look right." No travel buddy to hear her cough in the night. She likely didn't even realize how serious her symptoms might have been. She had done this before. She'd traveled solo across Bali, Java, and northern Thailand. She'd slept in huts, ridden motorbikes through rainstorms, eaten street food in Mumbai. But this was different. The body doesn't always warn us in the way we expect, and that's why her story matters, not because it was rare, but because it wasn't. So what can we take away from this? If you're traveling alone, especially in places with altitude, minimal emergency access, or a language barrier, bring a GPS-enabled emergency beacon. Devices like the Garmin InReach or Zoleo can send SOS signals, even when there's no cell service. Get a local SIM. Buy one at the airport. Activate it immediately. Wi-Fi is not a substitute for cellular contact when your life is on the line. Check in daily with someone you trust. Send them your location. Tell them your plan. Make it part of your routine. Pay attention to altitude. Spend your first day at rest. If you're arriving somewhere high, hydrate. Avoid alcohol. Monitor your symptoms. If anything feels off, even a little, seek help. And finally, never romanticize being alone at the cost of your safety. Strength isn't proven in isolation. It's proven in wisdom. Knowing when to pause, when to reach out, and when to say, "Not today." Katie's life was not defined by the way it ended. It was defined by the courage it took to live the way she did. She chased beauty, she believed in healing, and she made people feel something real without filters, without fear. Let her story be a light, not a warning, but let it remind us, the places that promise peace can also test our limits. And in those places, silence isn't always serenity. Sometimes it's a signal, one we can't afford to ignore.